Good evening, everyone. My name is Meg Maguire, and this evening I'm representing our head of school, Beatrice Chepek-Reid, in welcoming you all to this, our annual lecture. I would also like to extend a special welcome to our guest speaker this evening, Melissa Benn, and to Viv Ellis, who will be giving the vote of thanks. Melissa Benn hardly needs an introduction for educationalists and for educational policy makers. She has an incredibly long-standing reputation for her writing, for her activism, and for her educational campaigning. She's published a number of books, including 2 novels. Nice thing to do. Her most recent books include School Wars, The Battle for Britain's Education, and What Should We Tell Our Daughters? The Pleasures and Pressures of Growing Up Female. Melissa is a regular speaker and broadcaster. Until recently, she was the chair of Comprehensive Future, a cross-party group campaigning for an end to selective education. She's a founder member of the Local Schools Network. And in 2012, Melissa won the Fred and Anne Jarvis Award, and Fred Jarvis was the leader of the NUT for very many years, and it was a great award. It was presented by the National Union of Teachers for her campaigning and for all her work for the cause of comprehensive education. And tonight, we're delighted to welcome Melissa to discuss the ever-changing landscape of the English school system and the implications of these changes for democratic provision. In the talk tonight, Melissa is going to draw on her latest book, Life Lessons, The Case for a National Educational Service. This is a book which puts forward the argument for genuine public education, shaped by democratic principles. The argument is it's going to be a similar system to that of our National Health Service, to replace the current complex, segregated system of maintained schools, academies, chains, faith schools, free schools, grammars and comprehensives, and private education. In Life Lessons, The Case for a National Education Service, Melissa writes, "It's time for boldness, for the setting out of agendas that will bring real changes." Melissa Benn is talking tonight to us about the crisis in education. Where do we go now? Melissa, thank you.
First of all, can I check? Can you all hear me? Can you hear me at the back? Yes, great. So I'm really honoured and delighted to be asked to give this annual address at King's. I notice I'm going to be talking a bit later about Edu Twitter, which I'm sure some of you follow, and I notice I've actually got my own hashtag tonight called Ben2019. So can I say, if you don't like what I'm going to say, can you please keep it this side of courteous? And if you do like what I'm going to say, can you say it frequently? I noticed somebody's already tweeted that they don't like the title, and actually I'm going to agree with them. I don't know if Joe Halgarton is here, but he's already made a comment. So I know the lecture was advertised as the crisis in education, but crisis is a term I actually don't like to use, not least because there are so many leaders and teachers that do such great work, some in really difficult conditions and some in relatively favoured circumstances. And I think the last thing that any head or teacher or pupil or parent, that anxious creature, the modern parent, needs is to feel further worried or demoralised. But for all that, I have to say we meet at what I believe is a particularly unpromising time for English education. Now, it's also an unpromising time for our country. Our nation is, quite frankly, in a state of paralysis, dealing with the multiple effects of austerity and inequality and really frightening political and cultural divides. Political attention is currently obsessively focused on a phony contest between 2 worryingly right-wing figures, the blonde one and the bland one. As, that's actually Angela Rayner, the Shadow Education Secretary's line, but it's a good one, so always take other people's good lines. And despite promises made during the campaign by both Johnson and Hunt around spending in education and raising public sector pay, I would guess that any future Conservative Prime Minister is unlikely to repair the yawning gap in funding. We've had seen a real terms 8% cut since 2010, nor break down the stubborn inequalities in our system. But unpromising as this moment undoubtedly is, the simplest of my messages today is that we must not give up hope of an education service run on different lines. What's that interesting Milton Friedman quote? I'll give it to you now. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, he continues, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. Milton Friedman was, of course, a prominent advocate of a very different kind of alternative, but his point was sound. Those of us who want change have to keep pressing our case, especially in the most unfavourable of times. So this evening, what I want to do is keep faith with the notion of an alternative and that there is a different way. And I propose to do this as follows. First, to offer a critical commentary on current orthodoxies, to dissect just a little the underlying realities of our system today. Then I want to set out some of the key elements of a more radical and hopeful vision. And I want to end by asking, in good faith, what and where do possible points of consensus exist across the political spectrum? How can we win support for a different approach? So let me turn by starting to what I call, with the tiniest tongue in my cheek, the new educational establishment. I recently heard Michael Gove, when briefly and unsuccessfully pitching for the job of Prime Minister, assert unequivocally and without challenge from the BBC that his reforms from 2010 onwards had saved our education system. He had vanquished the blob, driven out the unions in favour of teachers, funny that, I thought the unions were made up of teachers, and returned knowledge to the classroom. Of course, Gove is only the most famous and controversial exponent of the New Schools revolution, that revolution that officially began in 2010 and has been carried forward since 2014, when Gove was sacked by his line manager, David Cameron, by a fresh generation of administrators, think tank types, CEOs and commentators, what I call the new education establishment. I was going to say that as a group, they moved from being insurgents to controllers. But one of the really interesting things about this generation is how many of them have begun their careers pretty much in charge of things. This is a relatively young establishment, and that's part of its apparent dynamism, but it also may be one of its dangers. So some of the thinking of this group can be gleaned from that strange half-lit space called edu-Twitter. Now here, despite the often deliberately flippant tone, which is another new feature of our political culture, incidentally, and one actually not shared by those who are opposing what's going on. Those arguing for an alternative tend to be really quite sober and earnest, while those who are running things are much more deliberately lightweight. And I think that's interesting. So by following edu-Twitter, which is an important sort of part of media now, one can gain daily insight into the current, quite steely orthodoxy. So I'd like to sum up that orthodoxy as follows. Crisis, what crisis? Come on, this is an exciting time to be in education. So much dynamism, so many good ideas. Corporate involvement in education, it's uber, that's a capital U, it's uber exciting. As for knowledge, the progressive hegemony has been slayed. Trade unions, nice enough people, completely irrelevant. Local government, let's find a minor role for the poor saps. Private education, let's not knock it, let's learn from it. State schools just have to beat privilege at their own game. And let's face it, we are getting there, particularly with the rise of the best kinds of academies, free schools, and super selective sixth forms. In essence, the NEE, New Educational Establishment argument, goes, education has been liberated from the constraints and inefficient shackles of the local state, and through this process, comprehensive education has finally come into its own, albeit in semi-privatised, meritocratic form. These voices and this line of argument matter because they are constantly picked up, echoed and amplified in significance by the educational press, mainstream newspapers, the BBC, and other broadcasters. Such ideas also enjoy the direct support and patronage of government and the major charitable and corporate players in education. But most important of all, they directly reflect and shore up the massive shift there has been in the organisation, funding and structure of our schools over recent decades. I doubt that I need to inform a King's audience about the many changes we have seen in education over the past 30 years, and particularly the last 10, or the ways in which we can trace connections and continuities in policy formation down the years. But let's quickly remind ourselves of the direct line that runs from Kenneth Baker's City Technology Colleges, set up in the 80s, through to New Labour's Academy programme in the noughties, right through to Gove's mass academisation, particularly of secondary schools in 2010, from 2010 onwards. Or the common position that lay behind Thatcher's bulldozing of the Greater London Council and the Inner London Education Authority, through to the distrust of local government under New Labour, to the continuing undermining of a local role in education that there was under Cameron and Clegg, and now under May, soon to go, and I'm sure under Johnson or Hunt. So, or let's look at the points of similarity between Baker's cumbersome national curriculum introduced in 1988 and the directly interventionist role of educational ministers in drawing up the recently redrawn tougher GCSEs and A-levels. In short, we just need to remember that what was once a national system, locally administered, advised by a variety of expert bodies, and not perfect, I would never argue that, is now a centrally directed but fragmented semi-market, a hodgepodge of single academies, multi-academy trusts, maintained schools, religious schools of various kinds, free schools, pupil referral units, and just announced this week a new kind of school, the secure school. This proliferation of school type, governed by different and often discriminatory rules and two parallel accountability systems, what remains of local government and the new rather shadowy Royal Regional School Commissioners, is almost impossible to keep on top of. It overlays what was an already highly segregated system. This complexity, I would argue, the sheer institutional mess of it all, a system that needs constant tweaking and then constant commentary on the constant tweaking, works in favour of small c conservatism. Important then, I think, to step back and try and identify the core weaknesses in the current landscape. So firstly, we've long been told that competition drives up standards and fosters dynamism, but of course markets also produce a worrying measure of instability. We can see that in the crisis of recruitment and retention in all sectors of the profession. According to the Department of Education, of secondary school head teachers aged under 50 who were appointed in 2013, 31%, nearly a third, had left a few years later. 1 in 5 primary school head teachers quit their posts over the same time period. It's just been announced that 44% of teachers leave before 5 years are up. In 2018, 40,000 posts in teaching in this country remained unfilled. We can also see that instability at work in a shortage of school places in some areas, with class sizes growing, and a worrying surplus in other regions. Or we can see it in the plethora of teacher training schemes, 17 at my last count, many of which offer intensive but incredibly short-term training. And then there's the steady increase of unqualified teachers in our schools. We see that instability again in the sad story of SNOs, schools that nobody wants, that i.e. schools that can't find a sponsor, or in failing academy trusts, which are nevertheless still handed new schools to manage, or the tawdry tales of related party transactions, deals done between school leaders and their friends and relatives. Add to that the vast amounts of public money used to shore up failing trusts or to purchase public land for the establishment of new schools that are run by semi-private bodies, or the public money handed out to trusts that do not use the funds for the purposes stated. Secondly, while the rhetoric around the new schools market is all about disruptive innovation, I think the evidence suggests that the change often reinforces the status quo. The free school experiment is probably the best example of this. Sold to us back in 2010 as an innovative form of popular democracy geared specifically to tackling educational disadvantage. Nearly 10 years on, it's clear even to those who run free schools that they have lost and have abandoned that defining purpose. Given that all new schools, even those commissioned by local authorities, must be free schools, academies from scratch, most are now established by existing multi-academy trusts. There is no clear evidence that free schools serve poorer children in larger numbers than the schools they were designed to replace, and there have been some notable examples of them doing the exact opposite. And far from promising innovative approaches to teaching and learning, another of those early promises, most, not all, free schools follow the most traditional curriculum and teaching methods. Only last week, Toby Young, one of the original founders and advocates of free schools and a former director of the New Schools Network, which has experienced quite a lot of market-related churn itself, 6 leaders in 9 years, I think. Toby Young argued that free schools should no longer be considered the vehicle for parental choice and innovation. The proven way forward, he now claims, is the English version of the urban no-excuses charter school, the kind of school run by chains such as Ark, Harris and Inspiration Trust. But more generally, our entire education landscape has been shaped by the supposed values and content of the most traditional of values and institutions. The core subjects of the EBAC are pretty much the same as the core grammar school curriculum of 1902. Private schools are constantly sold to us as the best model of education without reference to the alchemy of privilege which underlies that success. The fact that on average 3 times as many resources are invested in our most privileged children. Nor does the commitment to traditionalism seem to grasp the fact that private schools, recognising the kind of skills that their students will need in a modern, fast-changing economy and world, are now much more progressive than those in the public system. Regardless of this, state school students must be stuffed into blazers, lectured on character, never been sure what that is all about, organised into houses, and taught in serried rows. Thirdly, by refusing to look at our school system and our society as a whole, I think the loss of the new education establishment feed a partial and dishonest narrative about educational disadvantage. Under Thatcherism, I found it interesting to recall, there was an aggressive but largely unspoken fatalism about the educational potential of most working class children, which was a hangover itself from the divides of 1944. Under New Labour and then the Coalition and Conservative governments, social mobility became the defining mantra, and education sold to many families as the way to get ahead, as long as they could escape bad schools and their children get to university. Yet for all the structural upheaval powered by this narrative, the gains, as set out by the proponents of this argument, have been few. In education, we have seen only a marginal shrinking of the attainment gap between affluent and disadvantaged children, and a fractional increase in the number of children on free school meals to get to the top universities. For those who go to the lower-ranked universities, often taking on a bigger burden of debt due to the abolition of maintenance grants, there's a crisis in post-university employment, a shortage of appropriate jobs for the new flood of graduates. Higher education does not guarantee prosperity in a stagnant economy, and as competition becomes ever fiercer, it is the children of the affluent who get ahead, largely by achieving more highly in all kinds of schools and by getting into the more prestigious universities. At the same time, the NEE narrative obfuscates or labels as defeatist or irrelevant some really important truths about the relationship between the economy and education, such as the impact of wider social and economic inequality on student outcomes and the severest forms of poverty on our classrooms daily. Nor is there much substantive or sympathetic discussion of the still segregated nature of our school system, made worse by the expansion of selection under Theresa May's government, or the covert selection encouraged by the so-called freedoms of the academies and free schools. So what might an alternative approach look like, and how do we argue for it? Last autumn, I published Life Lessons, the Case for a National Education Service. Since publication, I have travelled around the country talking to audiences in Bristol, Liverpool, Lewes, Birmingham, Oldham, Oxford, Canterbury, Cambridge, and more. Many of the same themes have emerged over and over again. The expense and patchy provision of early years education, the funding crisis, particularly for those children with special educational needs, popular resentment and fightbacks against forced academisation, fightbacks which have become increasingly successful, I note, the drill and kill of so much of today's learning, our punitive accountability system, and the slow drift of public education from public hands. But there's also been passionate debate at all these meetings and in politics in general about what needs to change. So let me pick out some of the key substantive policies of a national education service, or you can call it a new educational settlement if you don't like the sound of the NES. I don't really care. Let me pick those out before delving a little more deeply into the ethos that we need to develop behind the call for change. First, the need for free education is, in my view, paramount. The abolition of tuition fees was rightly a hugely popular Labour manifesto promise in 2017. I find it almost criminal the way that student fees and the interest rates imposed on student fees have grown exponentially over the last decade. And that's not just because I have two daughters in their early 20s. It might have something to do with it. In Life Lessons, I argue that free university education could be underwritten by a mix of central government funding and an all-age graduate tax, taking the burden of huge debt off young people at the beginning of their lives. Second, we need to broaden our focus when it comes to any definition of education. From cradle to grave, the term goes. The idea of education on offer from the early years to the end of life. Most of us finish school at 18, university at 21 or 22. We then live and work and love and reproduce and vote, all activities that benefit from deepened human understanding for 50 or 60 more years. It doesn't make sense that the vast proportion of our education spending is directed at the school years, particularly when we know that school fails so many children and that those so failed will need as adults to catch up, to acquire new skills or even basic skills, to pursue new and old intellectual interests right into midlife and later. We all know people who didn't thrive in school, but who developed a thirst for learning later in life. My younger brother did not go to university until he was 47, by which time his intellectual focus was remarkable, far sharper than most of today's freshers. We all know that those whose basic education was patchy and who want to make up the deficit, or those who want to switch jobs and careers and need access to training. We all know people like that. We all know people, in fact, I hope we all are those people who never want to stop learning and would like access to interesting courses on a range of political, literary, artistic and scientific topics. I came out of the LSE at 22 feeling more ignorant than when I went in. That's no reflection of the LSE, I'm not making a point. Because the more you learn, the more you know what you don't know, and the more you learn about what you want to learn. So, you know, education up to the end of school or the postgraduate period is just the beginning. So these are the human realities behind terms such as lifelong learning and adult education, but really such terms don't mean much without the structures and resources to create and sustain them. The more such services have been axed, oops, sorry, that takes off. Shall I do something? No? Okay. But the more such services have been axed or limited to low-level vocational type courses, the less the public understand what they are not getting, and how a much richer array of educational opportunities could transform their lives. Rebuilding them, particularly at a local level, upwards, to fit contemporary needs, I think is an absolute priority. Thirdly, we need to bring public education back into public hands. This really came home to me on a human level when I spoke earlier this year with the lead member for education at Birmingham Council. During that meeting, she admitted to being largely helpless to do anything about the problems in many of the city's academy schools. Note too how many academy trusts run a group of schools that are far distant from each other, losing valuable local knowledge in the process. In contrast, look at some of the best systems around the world which presume much higher levels of municipal or local government involvement, systems that are often reflective, responsive, and genuinely innovative more than our own. Does it not make sense for key decisions on everything from school place planning, school admissions, which is a hugely important topic, the coordination of health and social services to be decided and managed at a local level by elected representatives? This is not local authority control, the great bogeyman of the new right narrative. This is local oversight and support with a direct line of accountability to local people. Fourth, we have to stop infantilizing our teachers, to treat and pay them like proper professionals. That means developing more in-depth teacher education and continuous professional development, and allowing teachers far more scope, not just to be autonomous in their work, important as it is, but to be more relaxed, to be freer to develop themselves as learners themselves as well as teachers, freer to enjoy their work. Finally, I think those of us proposing change have to square up to something that the new right has simply refused to do, which is to tackle the continuing inequalities and de facto segregation, both within the state system and between state and private education. I think our long-term aim should be to create a genuinely public education system, ideally one through which all children can and will pass. So those are some of the policy building blocks of a new educational settlement. But I think we also need an alternative narrative, one that will persuade people of the need for these short and long-term changes. Sorry to mention him again, but Michael Gove actually offered us an interesting lesson in the importance, particularly in today's political and media culture, of having a popular and easily understandable story about where we've come from and what we are aiming for. The Gove story revolved around the glories of high culture, largely as delivered through private and selective schools, and how wrong it is that poor children can't access any of these wonders. State education, therefore, should mimic these institutions and the values that underlie them, allowing the best and most talented to rise regardless of background. It's less clear in this narrative what should happen to the majority who fail to rise in any significant or impressive fashion, but I presume they are considered to have acquired some useful general knowledge along the way. An alternative narrative, I suppose I would call it my narrative, our narrative, inevitably lays stress in different places, and it actually has more to say to and about the majority. Ours is an argument for expanding democratic culture rather than fostering a false idea of a meritocracy, and is based on a belief in the educational potential of all children. It stresses the idea of education as a thing in and for itself, a public good, to use that wonderful term. And such an emphasis brings different priorities, such as a broad and balanced curriculum for all, smaller classes, significantly more resources to the schools and classrooms of the most disadvantaged. Why? Because it's the right thing to do, and it will expand the intellectual, creative, and life possibilities of every child. In place of social mobility, we talk of social justice, education as every citizen's right and one that should be available to them, as I've argued throughout life. Now, some of this narrative is beginning to trickle down from the current Labour leadership, in particular the importance of a broad and balanced curriculum, proper early years provision, and significantly improved funding. I believe Labour plans to increase spending on education from 12% of national GDP to 20%. All of that is great. But I think we could and should be even bolder. I've long thought that Labour could make far more of its own tradition and historic achievements. The move from a divided system in 1944 to a broadly comprehensive one in the 60s and 70s was led by a Labour government. It was one of the most profound and peaceful revolutions of post-war Britain that nobody, not even Thatcher, dared undo. And yet the party has never quite owned that revolution. Certainly not under Tony Blair, but not even under Ed Miliband or even, I would say, Jeremy Corbyn. But as well as owning and celebrating the achievements so far, we have a constant need to update the comprehensive narrative, to acknowledge its weaknesses and blind spots, as well as the ever-changing conditions of the economy and society now. History teaches us that our national educational story is about the consistent and appalling underestimation of the potential of whole groups of learners. Working-class children consigned to second-rate schools by the grammar secondary modern divide that held sway from 1944 to the mid-60s. Black children subject to racist stereotypes and degrading categorisation, so much so that black parents set up their own supplementary schools. Children with special needs, often excluded from education, judged as inherently less competent or in possession of less potential than their peers. And of course, until relatively recently, certainly when I was at school, girls as a group were judged to be less capable, less clever than their male peers, particularly in STEM subjects. At the same time as holding this understanding in our mind, we must not forswear the need for high expectations, commitment to rigour and challenge that the right appear to have stolen for their version of state education, and which is so appealing to so many parents. The NEE, New Education Establishment, would wipe our memory clean of anything that happened before 2010, even though history is considered a very core part of the curriculum, which is why I insist on reminding audience quite often of how rich and exciting so much of the practice was in early comprehensive schools, much more like the learning on offer in today's much-praised private sector. I experienced a taste of that kind of education myself at a pioneer London comprehensive in the 70s. This offered a plethora of languages, music, arts, sport, and cross-disciplinary political and cultural study and debate. Is it not ironic and a little depressing that in the drive for so-called higher standards, we've so impoverished the curriculum over the decades, to such an extent that even the Chief Inspector of Schools is now trying to right the balance? In short, inclusive comprehensive education is not some airy-fairy idea about happy playgrounds and everyone learning about everyone else's religious festivals, which has been, I've heard people say, and they have said to me. It is best understood as a national determination to offer a serious, stimulating and challenging education to everybody, but with a clear recognition of the different starting places and particular needs of groups of learners and individuals, and the allocation of sufficient resources in order to enable the progress of all. It also need not ignore or sacrifice the needs of those most quick-witted, deep-thinking young people, the so-called highly able. This is a charge often laid at the feet of comprehensive schools, albeit one made up of part myth and part poor practice, and again is a significant driver in parental anxiety and ambition. All of this is a huge task, but surely the most worthwhile one imaginable. And I think if you want to hear some of our school leaders today express those ideas, listen to people like Jeff Barton, who was an experienced head of a Suffolk comprehensive, now the head of the Association of School and College Leaders. He is particularly good at celebrating both the inclusive and the intellectual and creative possibilities of comprehensive education. To achieve this, we've also got to shift the narrative on accountability. Of course, schools have to be accountable to the government, to the people, to the taxpayer. The public good must be served and be seen to be served. Standardised assessments make things easy for everyone, particularly politicians. I feel their anxiety, I really do. This is an anxiety that, again, we can trace back in time to Jim Callaghan's famous 1976 Ruskin speech, the point at which politicians began to arrogate to themselves the responsibilities and judgments that had previously largely belonged to educators. Accountability today is still conceived largely in terms of results and progress, SAT scores, GCSE, A-levels, Progress 8, and university destination. But something has gone very wrong. Both human understanding and educational quality has been lost in the process, as so many heads, teachers, parents now recognise. After all, raw results as often reflect school intakes as much as school improvement. Ofsted categories are inherently flawed and anyway may soon go. So are there not other ways that we can ensure that schools do a good job without having to hand judgment over to bureaucrats and data obsessives? The Labour Party has announced that it will abolish SATs, and I welcome the serious thinking that is now going on in various forums about alternative forms of assessment. We must do the same in terms of policy around early years, where a form of pseudo-academic pressure and premature labelling of children's capacities risks putting generations of children off learning. But surely there remain lessons to be learned from the London and National Challenge, that scheme which brought experts into groups of schools to suggest and oversee change. Wouldn't it be better to encourage a self-critical culture that allowed schools and heads openly to discuss the problems they were struggling with, as well as to share and display what they do best? Why not create an inspectorate that is more locally based, made up of former heads and senior teachers that could keep a steady eye on a group of local schools and provide objective but balanced judgments to both the professionals working in them and provide reports for the public, the community and parents? Finally, our narrative must be even more ambitious when rethinking the purposes of education. In his forthcoming book, Reframing Education, former head Mike Murray reminds us of Raymond Williams' important ideas on the creation of a common culture. His belief in the significance of breaking down inherited and rigid patterns of class thinking when designing the organisation of education and our curriculum. In The Long Revolution, Williams sets out a broad curriculum for the comprehensive age, the lineaments of a culture that should be available to all children. Even though he set this out more than 60 years ago, the kinds of learning that Williams declares as necessary and important feel distinctly modern compared to much of what passes for powerful knowledge today. Williams' curriculum, for instance, covers all the subject areas, including, interestingly, the environment and knowledge of it. He also talks of, quote, extensive practice in democratic procedures, including meetings, negotiations, and the selection and conduct of leaders in democratic organisations, close quote. And the need, he adds, for a sophisticated understanding of modern media, to which, in today's world, we would have to add Twitter, Instagram, and podcasts to the list. Given that we now live in a much more dangerous world and on a threatened planet, an understanding of how to participate and influence democratic processes is more important than ever. As Mike Murray says, it follows that the preconditions for a successful and sustainable society and economy require students to be educated not just to operate effectively in competitive markets, but to collaborate creatively in groups, live within supportive and enabling domestic arrangements, and be aided by an effective state. So I want to end now by drawing together a few of the threads in this talk and to try and pick out possible points of agreement across the political spectrum. After today's lecture and my dissection of what I see as the assumptions and weaknesses behind current educational orthodoxy, you might not think that's possible. But actually, I'm rather more optimistic, not least because I know from my own experience how political change can come in quick and surprising ways, often after years of apparently unrewarding slog, particularly if those ideas left lying around have been well articulated and people have become used to hearing them. I was struck while researching life lessons by how many people across the political spectrum are worried about the cuts, instability, inefficiency, and the narrowness of ambition in today's schools in particular. And many people are worried about what's happening in universities. I've also gained really important insights as a campaigner, particularly in my role as chair of Comprehensive Future, a cross-party group campaigning for the phasing out of selection and in favour of fair admissions, a group now ably chaired by Dr. Nuala Burgess from this university. From this work, I came to understand how many in the new educational establishment really dislike the 11+. This includes influential leaders of Teach First, senior figures in major academy trusts, and the former Chief Inspector of Schools, Sir Michael Wilshaw. All were and remain resolutely opposed to Theresa May's recent attempts to expand grammar schools. given the continuing evidence of the ways in which selection widens rather than closes the attainment gap, I believe such influential figures could be persuaded of the wisdom and fairness of phasing out this divisive and unreliable exam altogether. Similarly, there are many in today's landscape who have the ear of the powerful, who recognise some of the system's failures and are pushing for alternatives. Professor Becky Allen, formerly of EduData Lab, has spoken powerfully of how we need to make teaching a doable job once again, a job for life. Professor Stephen Gorod and Nadia Siddiqui of Durham University have incontrovertibly demonstrated the absurdity of the proliferation of school types which make no real difference to educational outcomes. Figures like Martin Robinson and Tom Sherrington work tirelessly to develop more intellectually stimulating frameworks for teaching and learning, approaches that go way beyond the standardised traditionalist methods. A number of younger writers, some of them teach-first graduates who've left the profession in order to find ways to improve it, have recently produced wonderful studies that dovetail with many of the arguments I've laid out today. Lucy Crean's book, Cleverlands, a look at 5 of the top performing systems around the world, actually stands as perhaps the best contemporary restatement of the efficacy of comprehensive education. For the record, she would most like to educate her own children in the Canadian system. Alex Beard's Natural Born Learners reports and reflects on the excitements and benefits of innovative forms of teaching and learning in, among other countries, France, California, and Finland, in a world of rapidly developing artificial intelligence. For life lessons, I visited a number of schools around the country that have bucked the limits and harshness of our current system and are showing how education can be really exciting and personally transformative for all learners. And I would also commend schools like School 21 and XP Doncaster in Doncaster for attempting to do the same. I also think it likely that the work of the Learners Without Limit network, which rejects ability labelling and embraces the potential of all children, will move further into the education mainstream and play a part in refashioning our future school system along more exciting and egalitarian lines. Another reason for optimism: for the first time in decades, a serious challenge to private education is being mounted from both outside and inside the Labour Party, and we may well see a package of proposals for change soon put forward by influential figures. This might include an end to charitable status and the phasing out of state subsidies, an equal opportunity tax on private school fees, and a growth in contextual admissions to top universities. Such policies might be the start of a move towards a genuinely integrated system. These then are some of the pieces of the jigsaw that give me hope. Where, though, is the political leadership, the will, the organisation, the carefully worked out policies for government to bring this all to fruition, you might ask? Well, I suspect that you all know, as well as I do, that the best leaders are actually followers. They take the temper of the times, and when voices swell in sufficient number and with sufficient force that they cannot be ignored, then the politicians listen. And I've learnt this through years of campaigning. When others do the hard work of creating alternatives, then might the politicians borrow some of these good ideas. So yes, some of the current opposition parties, including Labour and the Liberal Democrats, are moving in the right direction. But I still believe, and you might expect me to say this as a campaigner, and it's what I'm going to end with, it's our job to make firm and courteous criticism. It's our job to propose better ideas to those that currently circulate, and it's our job to keep up the pressure. So I call on all of you who feel uneasy or even enraged at the current direction of our schools, colleges and universities to speak up and speak out and develop a carefully evidenced critique of what you dislike and patiently to discuss, develop and share realistic alternatives. We need everyone involved in education, be it researchers, teachers, students, activists, parents, grandparents, or just concerned citizens, to join in the discussion. Crisis or not, we have reached a crucial moment in our country's history and in our education system. What happens next is vitally important if we wish to make over both nation and education in a more sane, hopeful, stable and just fashion. Thank you very much.
to invite Viv Ellis to give our usual vote of thanks. Viv.
Thank you, Melissa, for a wonderfully critical and also optimistic lecture. I think the mark of a public intellectual is that combination of insightful analysis and the generous provision of a map that has a utopia on it. And I think Melissa is certainly one of our most persuasive and necessary public intellectuals. Thank you also to the organising committee who's invited me to respond tonight. It is a real honour and a privilege. So thank you to Meg, our chair, to Olivia Beckhurst, who's our communications officer. Now, I'm not sure whether they expected me to now channel Nick Gibb and kind of disagree on every level with what Melissa has said, which I'm not going to, because I share many of the kind of educational and political commitments that I think Melissa has. But what I'm going to do is use the short time that I've got to kind of emphasize a couple of things in what Melissa has said, both in this lecture and in life lessons, which I thoroughly recommend. So two sets of comments. First, general response to what Melissa has said. Secondly, very briefly, even more briefly, what this might mean for university departments of education, which is obviously a kind of a host for the lecture this evening. Institutions that have historically anyway had responsibilities for preparing teachers and for producing educational research. In diagnosing the causes of the current crisis, and I didn't choose the title of the lecture either, but I would go with crisis. I mean, I could substitute it with critical situation or the state we're in. But I think it's actually relatively patronizing to teachers who are experiencing a genuine crisis, whether that's of budgets, teacher recruitment, whatever else, to say that this doesn't exist. So in terms of diagnosing the causes, I think Melissa identifies marketization or quasi-marketization and competition within public services as a key part of the problem, and addressing the negative effects of marketization and competition are clearly a strategic part of constructing a national education service. But I would also want to isolate some other factors, actually, that Melissa has mentioned this evening and is in the book, that have led to these crises, plural, national and educational, that now confront us here in the UK, or even more specifically England. And I think one of those, a highly salient one, is central government's attack on local government that started in the 1980s and has at times escalated into attacks on public institutions and experts more generally. So there were two apparent bases for these attacks in the 80s, a question of competence, the allegation that local authorities lacked basic administrative competence, and questions of interference, that they, local authorities and experts, were obstacles to the legitimate reforms by central government. In 2019, the idea that central government alone has a unique claim to competence now, of course, looks quaint, if not downright ridiculous. And in my experience, even the most ardent advocate of academization would accept within a very few conversational turns that there were, indeed are, good and effective local authorities that support their schools to get better, just as there are incompetent and corrupt multi-academy trusts that don't. For me, an essential part of creating a national education service would be to strengthen local and regional government and democratic processes more generally, to ensure that local priorities and community needs are fed into what otherwise might become a national statist set of priorities. One of the often repeated mantras of this new educational establishment that Melissa has mentioned is, well, we are where we are. Academization can't be rolled back. Local authorities are relics of the past. And the new educational establishment's been really successful in promoting that message. But of course, they're wrong. As Melissa has said, and Michael Gove and Dominic Cummings demonstrated, if you have the political will and the energy and the ideas are available to you, you can do things quite quickly and change can happen fast. So for me, addressing what is sometimes rather grandiosely called the democratic deficit is critically important. The withering away of both representative democracy at local level, as well as opportunities for active participation in democratic processes. Crucially, it's not only a question of regulatory oversight. so that, for example, senior school leaders at a standalone academy can't pay themselves £260,000 a year, for example. Now, as shocking as that is, it's much more than regulatory oversights that needed. It's about the right of parents, carers, and the wider community to inform the development of their school and to insist that that school is responsive and accountable to them and not only accountable to the state. Politically, another factor in the current crisis, generally, nationally, and specifically in terms of education, is undoubtedly the crisis in conservatism, something we see played out every night on the news. On the one hand, a libertarian, relatively free market right, happy to let the market decide, committed to Milton Friedman's illusion of capitalism and freedom. On the other hand, a paternalistic, culturally nostalgic right, terrified, and I don't think that's too strong a word, of letting the market decide in fear of getting the wrong outcomes. So currently in education, we seem to have both a reluctant state and an authoritarian one, a state that regrets ever getting involved in public education and is keen to withdraw, and a state deeply afflicted by something that Paul Gilroy has called post-colonial melancholia, and wishes to turn back the clock to a mythic golden age. So to quote Gilroy, in the post-colonial twilight, to encounter difference produces only jeopardy. In response to that threat, the historic obligation to conserve culture produces a different conservatism, readily racialized, nationalized, and now gene-biologized. So in the current educational crisis, we end up with an official definition of knowledge that consists entirely of the Arnoldian quotation, the best that's been thought and said, and the promotion of a knowledge-rich curriculum without ever asking whose knowledge and for whose ends. My own resources of hope in responding to these crises, if you like, or post-colonial melancholia, are partly seen in the actions of some of the youngest people in society, whether school-age young people's impatient insistence on declaring a climate change emergency, or university students confidently asking their lecturers, why is my curriculum so white? And equally impatiently insisting on decolonizing the curriculum. However society deals with these legitimate demands from its citizens, they have to be dealt with. You can't just put people into those blazers, put them in rows, and pretend the questions don't exist, although it clearly is possible to try to do that. Which brings me to my final point. If we accept, then, that Melissa has given us some of the tools to think about how we get out of the current crisis in education, what roles do education departments like ours here at King's have to play? How can we contribute? Well, sadly, I think we're currently woefully underprepared to be of any assistance whatsoever. Generally speaking, and I'm talking in generalizations, I think there are two games going on that we're playing really well. There is the research game in which we produce papers that an incredibly small number of people read and rarely act on, and this is the ref game. And then there is the Ofsted game around teacher education programs where we try to get our outstanding grades and so on. Now, there are exceptions to this. This is a generalization. And in the room tonight from King's, we have at least two examples in Dr. Mel Cook's work with teachers of English to speakers of other languages, and Dr. Tanya de St. Croix's work with youth work professionals, both integrating close and mutually beneficial engagements with practitioners in the context of critical analyses of society. So that's the direction that we should be going in, but I don't get any sense nationally that that is the direction education departments are going in. We are playing these games and they're increasingly divergent. We haven't rethought the terms of engagement that we have with schools and other education professional groups. So, I personally find it pretty depressing that the new ideas about engagement with practitioners and professionals are indeed coming from those that Melissa describes as a new educational establishment, because they're committed to an entirely different view of education, an entirely different view of society. The momentum that there is in the opposite direction to the one that Melissa has been advocating for. So, for example, in terms of teacher education, the focus on the rehearsal of technical skills, without the cultivation of the professional judgment necessary to use them, or indeed improve them effectively, or the promotion of no excuses behaviour management policies, on the assumption if only the unruly child would shut up, everything would be okay. Now, the new educational establishment, I'm taken with this phrase and I'll carry on using it when the lecture's over, has been very effective at connecting these ideas to that of teacher workload. Quite misleadingly, in my view, you do not need to flatten the grass to make the job of teaching doable. But where are the other voices who are as equally rhetorically adept as these kind of followers of the Govian-Gibbian view and the new educational establishment? Where are the voices who are promoting the humane and the humanizing alternatives? I would tentatively suggest they are few in number. And collectively in the universities, I think we need to up our game, both in terms of engagement with practice and also with our own public communication. So finally, today is the 4th of July. So before we all go home and watch the military parade in Washington, D.C. on the television, I want to conclude by mentioning a figure that Melissa quotes in Life Lessons, John Adams, the second president of the United States. Adams' letter to a British reformer in 1785 has often been quoted to signal the public importance of the public rather than state education. It's an important distinction. So you know the lines. The whole people must take upon themselves the education of the whole people and be willing to bear the expense of it. Schools, he said, not founded by charitable individuals, but maintained at the public expense of the people themselves. Adams was also the primary author of the Massachusetts Constitution, and its famous education paragraph might count as one of the first pieces of formal education policy. In that paragraph, Adams legislated for the distribution of virtues, values, as well as knowledge among the body of the people, because this was necessary to preserve their rights and liberties. The responsibility that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was to accept was that public education was a public duty, owned by and accountable to the people, who are in turn responsible for its extension and development. The education paragraph of that Massachusetts Constitution is a timely reminder that the United States took public education seriously long before the English. But to come back to Melissa and what she'd argued this evening, we have to, I quote, we have, I quote, witnessed the slow drift of public education from public hands. We need to bring public education back into public hands. And that, for me, is the most fundamental lesson about the current situation or crisis, whether you like the word or not. Thank you.
And now it's your turn. We're opening it up to you. We have 2 roving microphones, 2 ambassadors, and we want to see what questions you would like to put to Melissa and or to Viv.
There's somebody over there. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Could we start? Sorry, okay, there then.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the word accountability.
Yeah.
You then asked a question, but you didn't answer that question. Could you put some more meat on those bones? You said in order to be accountable, we've got people chasing data. Totally agree with you on that. I'm an ex-teacher, by the way. People falling over themselves, and Ofsted inspectors falling over themselves to account for public money. Politicians will pick up on that. How do you suggest, if it's not being measured on SATs or GCSEs or A-levels, how do you suggest we square that circle so that we have a wider curriculum less measurability, less stress on teachers, because those were the points. I totally agree that that is a burden on teachers. Is there a better way forward? You asked the question, but you left it hanging.
Actually, I did try to answer it. I don't know if you were... I did try to answer it. I mean, I didn't say what place I thought exam results should have in accountability. I think they have far too much place now. We can agree on that. I think the biggest challenge for a future government that was trying to do things differently would be, how do you decide the value of an education if you don't just look at exam results? And I may have jumped over that point in saying, I think you have to bring human judgment into it. And I think that's why I think inspection from a national body, the most centrally directed body, which is so shaped by the political personality of the chief inspector. Michael Wilshaw has led a completely different Ofsted to Amanda Spielman. And I think in a funny way, people say, isn't it great, Amanda Spielman's talking about the curriculum now. But actually, is it so great that our schools are completely shaped by one person's political personality? So I've just thought of that, but it's a good point. But I like the idea, I think I did say this, of local inspectors, people who are heads, who are senior teachers. I mean, I was actually reading about Alberta today, and one of the head of their school boards is a retired bus driver. You know, I mean, maybe as a parent or something. Citizens with a concern for good schooling. I'm not suggesting a retired bus driver should be an inspector, but I think you could have inspectors that knew schools and had a distance from them, but also had a relationship with them, and could go in and see what the problems were, a bit like the National Local Challenge, the National London Challenge, and sort of talk it through, rather than this, you know, we all agree now, the sledgehammer requires improvement. You know, I've met quite a number of heads now who've been sacked for leading schools that were largely made up of disadvantaged children that couldn't get the results up. And you know, one of the problems for them is that some of the academy chains can get very, very good results, which makes the national debate be, why can't you be like King Solomon Academy in Paddington? But you know, there's quite a big question about how that's done and what that means. But my political point is, heads have now got angry, and heads that lead schools with disadvantaged pupils where they're doing their best, and then the heads are let go, have just said, this is not an accountability system that works. So I think we need a different kind of inspectorate. The other thing, which I did mention in a sentence, was Labour said it will get rid of SATs. I think now is the time to think, well, what alternative? Are we going to have sample assessments? You know, anonymous assessments. So you judge, you look at people's work, but you don't judge a school on it. So I think there are all sorts of ideas like that, which are alternatives to the kind of cliff edge that we have now.
Melissa and Viv, thank you very much. My name is Simon Lamb. I'm a newly qualified teacher. I have a BEd degree, which is a initial teacher education of 4 years, as you know. And I can identify with all the levels that you've been talking about, because now I'm a teaching assistant for an SEN child who has a education and healthcare plan. So the points you make about local government cuts, SEN, and teacher recruitment apply quite well to myself. I'm just interested in the kind of the fast tracking schemes of teacher training. I wouldn't be a big advocate of it, so I would support you further professionalizing it. I'm just interested to hear what those realistic alternatives will be. My primary concern would be that the further professionalizing of the teaching profession may lead to a push towards 4 or 5 year degrees that might be off-putting to those who want to kind of get into the profession. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, I think my thoughts are that the fast tracks become too fast and too short. And I mean, if you do look at the figures, I mean, the most favoured of teacher training routes is without doubt Teach First. It's the most officially favoured. But actually, it's got a slightly higher rate of attrition than the 44% figure. But I think some people would argue, and there may be people here who would argue, that actually the point of Teach First is not to train teachers, but to train future leaders in education, which actually is exactly what has happened, that young teachers go in, and a lot of them, 2 or 3 years in a school, and then they come out and become opinion formers in their mid to late 20s. Anyway, that's down the Teach First track. I mean, I'm always persuaded by, you know, a degree and a subject specialism, and then, you know, systems like Finland where you have a 2 years master's degree. And I'm also persuaded by writers like Peter Mortimore, who used to be the head of the Institute for Education, who talks about the need to understand a lot of the things that you're going to encounter, you know, human development, child psychology, also understand the system. You know, I think this extraordinary lack of knowledge of the history of our system among many people who are now completely breaking it apart offends me deeply as a senior citizen. So I think that when you go into teaching, you ought to understand about, you know, the history of education, the 19th century, the post-war settlement, comprehensive reform, all those things. You ought to understand about inequality and all those things, because I think it makes better teachers. So whether it would put people off, the thing is, in the current market, it would, because it's all a quick fix business. But if, as Becky Allen argues, teaching becomes something for life, when something is for life, you invest in it, you stay with it, you're supported in it, and it yields satisfactions. You know, it's not fast food, it's slow food, you see what I mean? So I think there's something about everything is now, we're going to do this, we're going to do it now, and that mitigates against people deciding to invest in a long-term teaching career.
Thank you very much to both speakers. That's really good. So the question, Melissa, is could you say a bit more about, you know, if schools aren't to go back to the local authority, you talked about a sort of a local overarching thing. Could you speak a bit more about how that would work?
Well, I think that's a kind of work in progress. When I talk about the creation of realistic alternatives, a lot of groups are now thinking, possibly some of them anticipating or hoping for a Labour government, or what would you do? I think there's a general agreement that you wouldn't go back to the settlement of the 60s and 70s. There's also a whole new layer of regional authorities which would come into play, you know, Manchester and Birmingham and the mayors, and there's of course the London mayor as well. But I do think that you would, I quite like the idea of school boards actually, that you don't have a local authority as you used to, which then it sends its elected representatives onto an education committee, but that you have directly elected school boards with people who are very interested in and knowledgeable about education within a given area. But that would be quite a revolution in our system. I also think, and the thing I was saying about lifelong learning, I think there's a place for areas bigger than local authorities to create lifelong learning possibilities within areas. I mean, the other thing to say is local authorities haven't been completely smashed to pieces. They're still there, and it's still possible to build them up. Because one of the things that's happened is they were the old education establishment, and a lot of people left them and went to work for the new for the Multi-Academy Trust. There's no reason why you couldn't have some shift of personnel back. And the final thing I'd say, which is a sort of politically compromising thing that Viv might not agree with, although I think you wouldn't, if Labour came into government, and who knows what's going to happen nationally, I don't think you'd immediately say end of free schools and multi-academy trusts. I think you would say end of forced academisation straight away, bring back to local authorities school admissions, deciding on school places, commissioning of new schools. But I think you would, over time, make free schools and multi-academy trusts more peopled with more representatives, because a lot of them are just totally corporate organisations. And really, they are. I mean, I try not to talk in cliches when I'm speaking or writing, because it's too easy to do. But are like businesses in many ways. And it's interesting to see the look of a local school that's run by a really, really efficient chain, and to talk to people about the feel of it compared to a maintained school. And there's something much chillier about it, people report.
I'd actually like to use my position to ask a question, and it's come up twice. When Melissa was talking, she said school admissions was the big central issue,
Yeah.
and she didn't elaborate, and I would like to ask her if she could talk a little bit about that to us, because I agree with you, and I think it's something that people often swerve away from.
Yeah, second time I've been told I didn't elaborate. You've no idea how long it took me to cut that down to 38 minutes. I mean, I had hours of material. Well, school admissions, the first thing to say is that under the reforms from 2010, as a result of them, 70% of schools now control their own admissions. And that means that, in effect, they can they have to abide by the school admissions code, but they can find ways around it, and it means that they can fix and alter their intake. And that is also a result of punishing accountability systems. If you're judged on results, it makes sense, in a way, for heads to try and get those who are going to do well in exams. And one thing that's really sort of emerged as a scandal is that of off-rolling, which people now realise is schools saying we're going to take these people off roll at the point where we're judged to be good or bad, and everybody recognises that's a problem. But I mean, school admissions has faith schools are a problem. I mean, I actually got involved with campaigning because I was a parent with my two daughters were in a local primary school that was incredibly socially, ethnically, religiously mixed. And there was a local school up the road. And going through that process, and only parents who've gone through it know, of secondary transfer in an active London market, schools market, taught me everything I needed to know about how school admissions worked. That the elite faith schools around London took the blonde, white, middle-class girls who went there on art and music scholarships. Never knew they were so good at art and music and drama when they're at primary school, but hey. Of course, the private schools took those with money. And what was left was that the local school, the local secondary school, looked like, parents would talk about it as a sink school. But it wasn't a sink school. It was a hard-working, great school that my daughters went to, but it had been, the middle classes had fled, and school admissions allowed them to flee. Of course, there's also grammars, which are the best example of unfair school admissions. I mean, whatever the government says about grammars being a route for social mobility, the figures are pretty clear. 3% of children on free school meals are in grammars. The test is unreliable. You can tutor for it. You have to have a few thousand quid to tutor for it. It benefits those with cultural and financial and social capital. And I really think those areas of the country, Buckinghamshire, Kent, Lincolnshire, that still operate a system that we had in 1944 are a disgrace. I think it's completely wrong. And I fail to see why Labour has not come out against, they came out against expansion of selection. They have not, no Labour government has ever said they will phase out the 11+. And that's partly why, although National Education Service is a sort of Labour idea, and I wrote it as a critical friend, sometimes I veer more towards the critical than the friendly in my position.
Thank you very much for this insightful talk. All the changes that you have been describing, sometimes like, I don't know, like summarized as neoliberal, is happening all around the world.
Yes.
And even though I am writing against them, like still sometimes I'm feeling whether all like the researchers or like parents or whoever they are, the stakeholders, whether we are kind of being outdated. You know, what I mean is these changes are happening around the globe. And I'm wondering sometimes whether there is a reason, like whether there is this, these changes are inevitable and we are just trying to fight that we shouldn't fight, even though I should really say that I am writing against these neoliberal changes? I just wonder.
That's a good question. I mean, my answer is going to be, if you think something's wrong, you should fight against it. And also the point I made in my talk, which is that you think you're at your darkest hour, sorry to use a Churchillian term, and change might come. And so if you've acquiesced, you would regret that later. Also, I don't quite see it happening all around the world. I mean, you know, everything changes so quickly, and I know that Finland, which is something everybody always talks about, is going through its own changes, but it's still still a system that's structured pretty sensibly and creatively, and is a system. I know it's a much smaller country than ours, and you know, every country has its own DNA, but I think it offers us hope. I think the provinces of Canada offer us hope. So I tell you what I was thinking when you were talking, is I think it's really hard for parents to, things happen, things change. Michael Gove comes in and says, I'm going to give you a better system, I'm going to give you higher standards, I'm going to give you good behaviour, and I'm going to rip everything up to do it. You have to be a very well-informed parent to understand what's really going on. Because what parent doesn't want good behaviour, high standards, and good results? And it takes time for the dust to settle and to see who's being cheated by these changes. And that's the other thing. I mean, I think popular anger does grow. And I think popular anger has grown definitely against forced academisation. You know, parents in schools say, I don't want this school being taken over by what they see as a hostile organisation. This is our school. So, no, don't feel it's inevitable. It always helps to meet other people who are fighting, you know.
Thank you. Thank you both for that. It was a very interesting talk. I just wanted to pick up the idea of having a sort of a local collective, if you like, of peers sort of reviewing one another's work and trying to raise standards through that. What appealed to me about that, I work in healthcare and healthcare education. And in the NHS, a sort of top-down and inspection approach and fault-finding approach has not really raised standards. The thing that really raises the quality of healthcare is quality improvement initiatives where clinicians and managers and service users themselves are working together to identify things that they want to improve and then coming up with solutions and then testing them out and trying them out. And it seems to bring about real change. Yeah. So I'm a real keen fan of that. But I'm just wondering about the accountability issue. And I'm just wondering, is there a tension sometimes if perhaps in an area there aren't great initiatives, or even worse, that people are moving things in a direction that many of us would have a problem with? And how do we deal with that sort of local accountability against what other people might look at and think, well, I don't want it to go in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I say is you know, so many of the reforms around higher standards have been top-down. And there's actually a very interesting book was published last year. I can't remember both writers, but one was Mel Ainscow, I think, and he had gone and looked at a famous academy. He didn't name it, but I think I know which one it was, where it said that in the beginning, the top-down initiatives worked really well, and then there came a point where everything collapsed because it wasn't, as you would call, inner motivation. So I absolutely believe you've got to build systems where the people who know best and people on the ground are engaged and enthusiastic. How you make sure that they are meeting commonly agreed standards, well, I think it depends what kind of system you have. If you have the sort of the results-driven system, that's one way they'll be looked at, but I think that's got weaknesses. If you have very you know, strong and harsh top-down management, they'll decide what's worth. You're saying, how would it work in an alternative? And I come back to an alternative system that was more involving elected representatives, and I come back to, you know, a more local inspectorate, elected figures who know what's going on. I mean, one of the things that really strikes me about education, and this is partly out of being a parent, I go and speak all around the country, as I said. I have to do a lot of reading before I go to any place to even begin to grasp what's really going on in that place. But when I was a parent at a school, I completely understood all the issues and all the layers. You know, it makes me sound like a nightmare parent. I was quite sort of good about it. So that's why I think, in a way, local knowledge and school-based knowledge is so powerful. But I do think you have to have people outside who are on your side but are outside, who are checking that things are still... You do have to have that. Because, you know, there were terribly neglectful local authorities, and there are terrible failing multi-academy trusts. So you do need checks and balances. I just think they should be more human rather than data-driven.